Hi class, welcome to the plaster mixing demo. A couple of things that you should have handy and with you when you are starting this is just cold tap water. Do not use warm water or hot water for this process. It will speed up the reaction time between the plaster and the water, and it is an exothermic reaction, which means that as the plaster sets off and becomes harder when the water mixes with it, it kicks off heat. So the plaster can get hot for 30 minutes or so. If you and that's the reaction, the exothermic reaction happening. That's the plaster getting harder. If you use hot water, your reaction time is going to speed up immensely. So use cold water. You need to have your container that you're going to pour your mixed plaster into for your cast block. And you need your plaster, which I have this stuff, and I got this at Blick, both made by DAP, both say Plaster of Paris. They have slightly different work times. This one says 6 to 12 minutes. This one says 7 to 13. I don't know why they're different, but they say they are. For all intents and purposes though, these look like the same product. The instructions on this product say to mix it 2 to 1. So 2 parts plaster to 1 part water. This says the same thing. So I am going to recommend that you don't quite achieve that mix. The reason being, if you do, it becomes a paste and not something that's pourable, as well as becoming a little more dense than we want it to be for our carving purposes. So I have, you can see these are ounces. Each line is 4 ounces. So I'm actually going to start with 12 ounces of water, okay? And you can measure either on a graduated cylinder like this, or if you have measuring cups, that's totally fine too. It all ends up being the same thing. So I'm going to start with 12 ounces of water. Now, if I do 2 to 1, then that's up to 32 ounces. So I'm probably not going to get to that point. Classically speaking, when you are mixing plaster and water together, before these directions came out, you would get the amount of water that you wanted, and then you scoop the plaster in and kind of move it around your hand so that you're breaking up any hard parts or clumped together parts of plaster so that it's relatively particulate when it enters the water. You don't mix it as you go. Do not. In fact, try to keep your hands dry while you're scooping the plaster into the bucket. The reason for that is so that you don't contaminate the entirety of your product with wet hands. If wet hands goes into this product in a day, it will not be usable anymore. So make sure dry hands go in here, and then try to drop it into the bucket. Like you're sifting flour, it doesn't have to be that perfect, but classically speaking, like I said, you know you have enough plaster to water when an island forms at the top of the water. That takes a little time, and it takes patience. So I'm scooping in with both of my hands. I have not a lot, but enough to handle. And I drop it in there. Just kind of move my hands back and forth. It will settle to the bottom. You will have a little bit of dust floating off the top. Try not to breathe it in. And I know that I'm going to get, my water line is at least going to get to 24 ounces. If I'm supposed to do 2 to 1, 2 parts plaster to 1 part water, again, that is 32 ounces. The water is still absorbing the plaster. If I let it sit for a moment, it will absorb all the plaster that is sitting on top, which I know you can't quite see at this point, but there is some sitting on top. Now it's getting, I have a nice island forming. I'm at 20 ounces, so not even a 1-to-1 yet. That is plenty. It is sitting on top. I'm going, before I mix it, it can sit like this for a few minutes, okay? Without really hurting the product. Now, if you see, I have an island. You can see it sitting in there, right? It's not going anywhere. I still have a lot of movement in the plaster. So, at this point, I'll mix it. And I'm putting my hand right in there. In my opinion, you need to use your bare hand so that you can feel the texture of the plaster. And get in there, you really need to make sure it is consistent and smooth. It is quite thick. And I am basically, using my hand as a whisk. Feeling around, getting the sort of clumps together. It's like if you're making pudding, you don't want lumps in your pudding. You don't want lumps in your cake batter. You don't want lumps in your plaster. And you want to try to get it all mixed and poured within, I don't know, like 6 or 7 minutes. That's good. I have all of this plaster on my hand. I'm just going to scrape it off as best I can into the bucket. And before it sets up, I'm going to take it and pour it into, yeah, there are some lumps, but it is in really good shape. You always want to scrape the bottom of your container too, so that you get any leftover residual things hiding in the corners. Now, the place where students mess this up is by mixing it and then going, oh, I want more plaster, and then scooping more plaster and putting it in. That's going to ruin your plaster and you wasted your money. You need to really follow those steps, keeping your hand dry while you're scooping the plaster into the water. And then once you go into there, don't ever go back into there until you've rinsed your hand off. Now, I'm going to tap this down a little bit so that everything levels out. Hopefully I'm tapping it more to create some vibration, so any air bubbles that are stuck in there will come to the surface so that they don't surprise me when I'm carving whatever I end up carving. Now, 12 ounces of water filled this to about this point. So I have roughly a 3-inch tall block of plaster in there. Because this is a food grade container, it shouldn't leak. It held milk at one point. And it is coated with wax, so it should tear off of your block very easily and not stick to the block itself when you're ready to, once it's set up. This will be set up, I would give it a couple of hours and you can probably pull it out of the block. Do not rinse this stuff out in the sink. Try to scrape as much of it off into a trash can as possible. This will not turn your hands colors or anything of that nature, but it can dry your skin out. So you're mixing it once. The plaster dust from carving it can also dry your hands out some, but not as bad as this. So I recommend scraping this off in the trash can and then going and washing your hands. For the container, you can leave it as is, and once it sets up, you can bend it a little bit and everything will crack off. So this is kind of an indicator when the residue in this container is hard, so is this. All right, pretty short demo, pretty straightforward. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Oh, and don't touch your iPad with your hand like that.